used to make cold calls to employees that I just heard about. Joe did this or Julie did a great job. And so I would just call them out of the blue. But many times it was a 30-second conversation, and I heard somebody say something really nice about you the other day, and I just wanted to say thank you.
CEO Voices, Leading with Communication, examines the communication that enables transformational leadership. In this episode, we speak with Jim Collins, former CEO of Corteva Agriscience, who shares thoughts on the role of communication in launching a new Fortune 500 company and the world's largest agriculture business.
Jim, thank you so much for joining us. June and I are thrilled to have you with us here on this edition of CEO Voices. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long, long time because your story and the story of your company is nothing short of fascinating, really. A big part, looking back, a big part of your role as CEO of a brand new company like Corteva was communicating this big bang, if you will. A lot of elements there. For starters, you guys came out of the gates as the largest pure play ag company in the world with a distinct mission and purpose. Can you talk a little bit about those early days and the essence of the message you were trying to convey?
Yeah, thanks, Steve and June. It's a real pleasure to be here on campus today, and I'm looking forward to the interactions. It's a great lead-off question. First, we worried a lot about culture. There's an old saying in business school that culture will eat strategy for breakfast if you don't get it right. And you look at the statistics and the data, most mergers will fail more often because the cultures don't come together. It's not because they didn't have great products and great strategies. They just failed to ignite that connection. So we were bringing together three very distinct cultures. You had, a DuPont culture over 200 years old. You had the Dow culture, a 190-year-old company. And Pioneer, even though it was part of DuPont, it was a totally separate third culture, very steeped in agriculture, all the way back to Henry Wallace and George Washington Carver, who, created modern hybridization in Iowa. So as we blended those together, making sure we were getting that right. The second part of that message was, for the first time, we were in charge of our destiny. Right. We weren't part of a corporate conglomerate anymore. There was no parent. We were in charge. So we worked a lot on what does it mean to be a leader? What are the kind of skills that we needed to develop? And then we worked hard to communicate those to the organization.
Jim, I had a wonderful conversation with a student who asked me a question, what is a corporation? And he stopped me in my tracks because it was such a interesting question, and at the same time, a question I didn't think I could answer. And when I met you and heard about the Corteva story, I thought, I can't wait to ask you, what is a corporation? Particularly, how did you start a Fortune 200 corporation?
I think it's an interesting comment because companies are built and grown in several different ways. A lot of them are from startups, right? Someone has a brilliant idea, they nurture it over many, many years. It starts in their garage, then they get some patents, and then they bring a product to market. And so you can imagine companies that evolved over hundreds of years. The DuPont company is a great example, 200 years to get to where it was today. Or you can take the quicker path like we did at Corteva. You can find bits and pieces in several other places and decide to merge those together, take the best of all of those and put them together and then spin them out as a standalone corporation. And many of the bankers that we worked with said it was actually a very rare occurrence that on June the 19th, or June 1st of 2019, when I rang in the bell at the New York Stock Exchange, we snapped our fingers and instantly created a Fortune 200 company. 15,000 patents, 22,000 employees with sales offices in 200 countries all around the world. It was instantly created. So I'm not sure which way is the better way because there were a lot of things that we had to immediately put together and act like a large company. We didn't have that benefit of learning a little bit along the way, but it was an exciting time, that's for sure.
Jim, and to that point, Genesis often begins with mission and purpose and values. We're hearing more and more about that, obviously. It's something our MBAs are acutely interested in. You guys came out of the gate with a very distinctive mission and purpose as an organization, one that you championed as CEO. Can you talk a little bit about that mission purpose, how it defined the corporation, how you embedded that into the culture. Because I think we're at this point in society and business development here in the 21st century where mission, purpose, or values are becoming competitive differentiators for businesses. And I hold up Corteva Agriscience as a gold standard in that regard. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, I think that's right. And that mission statement, that purpose statement that you talked about is very simple. It's about enriching the lives of those who produce and those who consume and ensuring progress for generations to come. And I remember the day we were working on that. There were 5 or 6 of us down at a farm that the company had in Maryland, and we were talking about a purpose and a mission that would excite and would ignite an organization. And so first, I think we got it right. It's simple. It's easy to remember. The second part about it that was really important was we finally figured out after many years who the customer was. And so it says right at the beginning, enriching the lives of those who produce. This company was going to be about farmers. And it was about bringing all of our technology together, not just to make them more profitable, make them more productive. It was about enriching their lives. So whether you were an Indian smallholder farmer, or whether you were an African farmer, or whether you were a farmer in Iowa, we were going to be about making their lives better. But the second, and I think the most important part here, is we also got right that consumers are driving the bus, right? It's the trends around food that farmers are going to have to respond to over time. So the second part of it is this idea of enriching the lives not only of those who produce, but those who consume.
Right.
And the exciting part there is we're all consumers. We can find ourselves in this mission.
Jim, I'd like to go back for a minute to the month of June, year 2019. You're on Wall Street spinning the company off. I believe you rang the bell at the New York Stock Exchange that morning. It was also just a few weeks past the end of a planting season in North America that was among the wettest and probably the coldest in American history. A black swan in its own right. And then fast forward a few months from there, it's February, March. We're in the throes of the pandemic. So you've, in essence, built a business, to June's point. How do you build a company? How the hell do you build a company in the midst of, these 2 extraordinary black swan events? What were some of those key lessons that you learned from that experience that you think helped really strengthen not only your leadership, but the company?
I can remember each one of those events like they were yesterday. And with the first one, I thought, could it get any worse? And then the pandemic, and then an activist investor. So you're right. There was a lot going on in addition to standing up and running this brand new company. And I really have 4 things that I look back on that I think helped me as I brought, along with my leadership team, as we brought the 22,000 folks of Corteva through all of that. And I think first it starts with preparation. As an executive, communicating with an organization is so important. And working through the integration, working through the antitrust reviews, working through investor days and investor conferences, making sure that we had our message honed and consistent, and we shared it in a consistent way. And so, it's a big thing for me, no matter how big or how small the event, making sure that I'm just taking a moment to prepare and have that message be very crisp. And then the second element, I think, is simplicity. Messages, I think, are just sometimes way too complicated. And so when we spun into that ag market, I thought about, as we went into not only that ag market but COVID, a very simple set of points that I could make to the organization, and I made them every single day. I communicated through email. I shot my own selfie videos from a cell phone at my kitchen table, and it was very simple. It was about keeping them and their families safe. It was about taking care of customers. It was about making sure we had the cash to continue to operate as a corporation. We needed a new plan quickly, and we worked on that. And then we just had to execute. And those 5 points were just simple, and I used them over and over again. I think third, I've found that I had to constantly make sure my message was relevant to what was going on in that world backdrop. So whether it was the activists, whether it was COVID, whether it was the social situations and unrest, that we all saw, it seemed like every month there was some kind of new situation that we had to respond to. And I often thought to myself as a 58-year-old male, how could I communicate to a young family who had 2 kids that were home from school and maybe parents who were suffering from COVID, because I wasn't experiencing that. And so I surrounded myself with folks that could help me keep that message relevant, and whether it was a message for a 28-year-old in our organization or the other 58-year-olds that were out there, I worked really hard at adjusting that message almost weekly to keep it fresh and relevant. And then I would say finally, it came down to me to sincerity. That I always wanted to be the person that was perfect, that had all the answers. I always wanted the scripts to be exact. I wanted the videos to be polished. And I found that the less polished I got and the more sincere that I became around that I didn't have all the answers, but I was there working hard to help, the feedback from the organization got even better, because they realized that that I was sincere in the message, and I was working really hard to help figure it out. So yeah, that was a tough 2.5-year period, but I had a great team around me, and the power of communications and those 4 elements of preparation, simplicity, sincerity, and relevancy, I think really carried me through.
Jim, you're a technology company. I mean, how did you handle COVID when you have a huge research division around the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. Clearly, as we went into the COVID situation, we had folks that seamlessly moved to working from remote locations. People who spent a lot of time on the phone and on the computer. And then we had some folks who were working in our manufacturing sites or our seed production plants. They couldn't leave. They had to be. So we had to adopt principles and protocols. And then we had a research organization. And so we went to kind of a hybrid model there. There were folks that were dedicated lab folks. We had greenhouse trials that were going on. I mean, we could have lost years of data and information had we let those plants not be tended to during these times. But then we had other folks who could do remote work, and so we adopted a hybrid. But as I look back, I don't think we lost any momentum through it. Matter of fact, I think we were a little more focused through all of that. We shed some work that probably wasn't relevant. The other part of what happens when you're a biotech and a big research company is we had amazing laboratories that could do DNA analysis. And so we found that we had a lot of volunteers who said, hey, there's a big need in this country for testing. And so we set up a testing lab at our several of our facilities, especially the one in Iowa, and we started doing tests for the state of Iowa. And then the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation approached us about doing some work for them on a broader scale. So we developed a high throughput testing protocol for COVID-19 and pioneered some of that technology as well. So I think our team actually got very excited about not just responding to ourselves during COVID, but also kind of helping the rest of the world through some of the challenges that we were facing.
Jim, you were a leading voice in the ag industry around environmental, social, and governance issues, or what we commonly refer to now as ESG. Critically important for businesses. Again, another topic that really resonates with our MBAs. And we're seeing lots of scrutiny around that, right? I mean, the SEC and others are coming out with discussions around certain standardization of requirements around reporting ESG. So you've got to not only walk the walk, you got to talk the talk. How did you, as CEO of this massive industry-shaping organization, work with your communication teams and your operation leads to make sure that, hey, it's great, Corteva, you're saying this, but how are you doing it? How did you bridge those two worlds?
Steve, I had this question a couple of months back, and I actually had to go out to my organization and ask them, what did they see that they felt like that we did differently? Because I didn't think that we did anything really special. And I got some interesting feedback. I see what people said that they saw was someone like myself who was willing to put my name on this on behalf of the industry. So I did stand up on behalf of our industry. And our industry needs a lot of work. We're not where we want to be, but I wasn't afraid to stand up. They said that I became a lot more approachable during all of that because I knew I had as much to learn as they did. And I was usually pretty approachable, but they said they saw a real difference in that. folks wanted to really talk about this. They wanted to see where I was, but I also wanted to understand where they were. So I formed a discovery team that I led myself. I didn't put this off on another person in the organization, our HR leader, or a diversity inclusion or an ESG leader. I just decided that this was something that I ought to champion. I created a safe place for all of us to talk about what was going on, mainly so we could learn together. I also started by saying, look, it's okay for you to explain to others that you don't understand their perspectives, but then I required folks to have an open and kind of a learning mindset, a genuine curiosity that even if I don't understand what you're saying, why am I not getting it? I thought we also tried to be open and willing to be respectfully challenging each other, even if it made you uncomfortable.
And you're a global company. What most interests me about Corteva is that when you do communicate, you try to communicate in the languages of all the countries that you're in. And if you have any town halls or big strategy sessions, you make sure that it's in the time zone that's appropriate. So you don't have people getting up at 3 or 4 in the morning to make sure that headquarters can beam in.
We did. I think it's the time that I spent in Asia Pacific, living and working in Hong Kong, realizing that corporations have headquarters and they have a geographic centricity to them. But the moment you begin to realize that the whole world doesn't think on your time zone, it really shows a level of respect. And so we started doing that. We would sometimes double up our town halls and have a kind of America's version of the town hall, and then have a Europe and Asia version. Sometimes I would do 4 town halls myself, just to show that I would want to get around, or we would hold the main town hall and we would move it around. We did have a very integrated communications organization, so they all reported in through a central clearinghouse. So we had the core messages, but we wanted to make sure that those messages then were filtered culturally and geographically by whatever might have been going on in those regions, because even the social issues we were facing in the U.S., they were very different in Brazil and in Indonesia and Africa. So we tried to take the core, but then build it out locally. And then they fed that back to us. Here's what we're saying in Brazil. And I tried to work that into my general messaging. So they heard it from me and as well as the local leaders that were sharing it.
As I'm listening to you, a lot of what you're saying to us and a lot of your leadership style comes from the long time that you were at DuPont and watched and listened and worked for other leaders. Can you tell a little bit about your career and what has shaped that we're listening to today?
My father was actually a DuPonter. He spent 40 years with DuPont. So the DuPont culture has been around as long as I can remember, literally. And then I spent 38 years with the company. And I'll never forget when I first started, DuPont had just acquired an ag business that had a manufacturing site down in Mobile, Alabama. And the engineering manager who sent me to this site said to me, "You'll go down there and teach them to be good DuPonters." And so I went down to this site, and I walked in the gate the first day, and I realized instantly that I was going to learn way more from them than they were ever going to learn from me. And I think that started a career of, first of all, listening more and being open to learning from others first. And I may have had some great ideas, but until I understood what was going on there, and they had some fantastic practices that I kind of took from there and infected back into DuPont. Later on, we did big acquisitions of Pioneer and the seed company, and I think we learned a lesson there that if we had integrated Pioneer into a DuPont chemical company, we would have messed it up. And so it's how do we get the Pioneer culture to infect DuPont and not the other way around? And then finally, an acquisition of Danisco, which was a food ingredients company. And I led the integration, but also the establishment of DuPont's biomaterials business. And we always thought we were a little bit different. We were the startups, and we were trying to infect DuPont with our culture versus the other way around. So yeah, that's how I've always approached that.
Jim, building off of June's questions around employee engagement, employee communication, I think June and I both agree that there's probably no other issue in leadership communication, or for that matter, just in business today, than getting employees engaged, getting them motivated, getting them inspired by where the company's going. And I have a pet theory that CEOs really set the tone for employee communication at various companies. And quite frankly, a lot of companies just don't do it well because a lot of their leadership really, to be very blunt, don't care about it. You were an exception to that. What was the secret sauce there?
It starts with the mission. I was just as passionate about that mission as everybody else. And it came, you could feel it in me and how I talked about it. I believed in it. I worked hard to communicate where it came from and why it was so relevant. And it was, I won't say it was easy, but it was exciting for folks to get on board with such a simple statement of who we were going to be as a company. I mentioned this idea of relevancy of the message. I always worked really hard to make sure that I understood a little bit something different about the group that I was communicating with at the moment, so that they realized it wasn't the standard canned speech. It had some thought behind it. It had a preparation. It had a little bit of relevancy. Another element I think about a lot is recognition. And I'm not talking about fancy financial recognition. I used to make cold calls to employees that I just heard about. Someone said in a meeting, Joe did this or Julie did a great job. And so I would just call them out of the blue. And sometimes they would hang up on me, think it was a crank phone call. And sometimes they thought they were in trouble. Why is the CEO calling me? But many times it was a 30-second conversation. And I heard somebody say something really nice about you the other day, and I just wanted to say thank you. And people would talk about that phone call to other employees, and all of a sudden, the CEO just isn't, this person. It's somebody who just called me a few minutes ago. And then there's another real funny story. There was an operator in one of our control rooms that read something that I put out and sent me an email note that he disagreed with it. And I said, great, well, let's have a conversation about that. So he was like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, why don't you, next time you're in the control room, here's my phone number. When you're at work, give me a call. So he calls me, and he's sitting in the chair, and he's chatting away with me. And his buddies are walking around him, and they're like trying to figure out who he's talking to. And he hangs up the phone, and they said, who are you talking to? I said, well, I called Jim Collins. I just had some thoughts I wanted to share with him. And that story, it went through every manufacturing site that we had about all of a sudden, any operator can just pick up the phone and call Jim. So it was that approachability.
Jim, there's another set of stakeholders that our students would probably love to hear how you manage this, and those are the investors and Wall Street. Can you talk a little bit about your experience? You had a tremendous amount of shareholder value during your tenure at the company.
This is an area where I learned a ton of lessons. Clearly, as a new CEO, I had been in front of investors before, but this was a whole new game. You were out there, and one of the lessons I learned is that commitments are forever. You don't get any do-overs. So when you make big commitments and you make bold statements, they remember all of those, and they certainly hold you very, very accountable to that. Second, it was transparency, and it's always a fine line between what you're allowed to be transparent around, giving all of the rules associated with a publicly traded company, and the things that you want to talk about. And so finding that fine line, and when you get it right, it leads to another thing around credibility. And so CEOs that have credibility with investors, and so I was brand new. So building that early on and trying to find that right mix between being as transparent as I could and creating some of that early credibility as I was somebody whose messages they could trust. I think third was around education. CEOs have to be aware that investors don't live in your company every single day. They don't follow you until your next earnings comes out, and they do a little bit of research and they ask you some really great questions, and then they move on because they're following 30 other companies. So what I think a CEO also has to do is be an educator. You really have to talk to investors and bring them along, teach them about ag, teach them about why the company was very different. So just don't assume that they know your business. And then I think you have to just make time for it. It's not a natural thing for a CEO to say, I'm going to go spend the next week or two in front of investors. So I had a great IR team that really pushed me and forced me to get out there. And it's not the the speed dating conferences where you meet with 50 or 60 in a 3-day period. I'm talking about the real one-on-one, go visit them where they're at, prioritize your big ones and make sure they get to know you, not just as a company, but as a person and a leadership team. Because when challenges do happen and things don't go perfectly, it'll be those relationships that they really fall back on. So those are some key learnings. I wasn't perfect in all of those, but I think it's something that goes into the mix here, and you do have to work on it in a total balance.
Jim, to wrap up our conversation, and really appreciate all your golden insights. This has been terrific. And I got to tell you, a couple of weeks ago, we had Indra Nooyi, the former CEO of PepsiCo, on, and you guys are preaching from the same handbook as far as the little touches, right? That June teaches in several of her elective classes about how important it is to pick up the phone and recognize people, pause and celebrate wins. Those little touches, memos, notes. Old school, if you will, but old school is becoming new school, and there's such a thirst for this. So that's what we're hearing from our MBAs, of really connecting. And I think the last couple of years with people being disassociated and working remotely, I think it's more important than ever, sir. So thank you for that. We congratulate you for that. A lot of people that turn into this podcast are folks like myself from a professional standpoint. We're responsible for putting words in the mouths of and strategy for CEOs and other executives for various organizations. A lot of challenges these people are dealing with at the moment. What would be the one piece of advice you would give corporate communication professionals today to best support their leadership, given all that's going on in the world?
Well, I mentioned a few of the simple things that I've found really helped me, and so I'll draw on that, and that's first the preparation. And look, I was the poster child for not having time for it. Nobody has time. We're always too busy. We're rushing from one thing to the next. There's always other priorities. And my communications team would always say, Jim, you really do need to just take a little bit of time and prep for this. So I would say, as a communications professional, hold those leaders accountable for taking the right amount of time to prep. And it doesn't have to be hours, but just shifting those gears and getting your head into that message makes a big difference. And I'm reminded of a quote by Norman Schwarzkopf. He said, look, there's no, he was a great communicator. He always gave great interviews, and he's notorious for having prepped for hours before those. But he would say it wasn't always about the prep and getting the message right. It was about the confidence that I knew what I was going to say. And so when that confidence comes, it just shines through. It's amazing. So whether it's 5 minutes before you run into a town hall, it's just, okay, focus, let's prep for this. And there's a relevance there, because you can be tone deaf to something that might be going on with a group or an organization. And if you're rushing and nobody gives you that moment of prep, you're going to miss that other key element that I talked about around relevance. And then I think simplicity. And I had a very wise communications person that worked for me a bunch of years ago, and she would say, Jim, the more you prep and the more scripted you get, the less genuine you become. You just look stiff. And so she would always say, prep just enough, but then that's enough. And she could tell when I had it. And so a little bit of that spontaneity and sincerity is a big part of it. And I used to use a teleprompter sometimes. I threw the thing away because
you mentioned earlier that there's a thirst for authenticity.
Right, and that relevance and that sincerity and that authenticity comes through. And if it's too sterile, if it's too scripted, you miss that. So prep enough, but then let the juices flow.
Jim, I'm going to make this required listening in my classes. Thank you so very much to all of those students out there who say, I'm just going to wing it and be, myself. You have just now explained why you just don't want to get up there and wing it, so I appreciate it. And as we come to the end of our time today, what advice do you have for those students out there that are listening today as they move on now to their careers?
Well, thanks for those kind words. A couple things I would share. I've mentioned some of those themes, but maybe it's two things. Be the one with your hand raised. Managers are out there looking for really bright folks who want to take on the tough challenges, and that fear of failure sometimes causes us to shy away from the tough things. Failure is an experience, and you learn from those. It's a great teacher along with the successes. And then second, it's a term I use. I say always take the sideways jobs when they're available. So there are jobs that are vertical, right? It's that promotion to that next level and that next level and that next level. But when the company gave me those sideways jobs, those ones that were kind of vague and not well scripted, and it was go study this or explore this, and maybe you didn't have enough authority to make some decisions, but you were doing a special project. I remember those are the jobs that I learned the most from because they were investing in me. They were taking the time to let me go learn. I wasn't responsible for a profit the next quarter. I had the time to go explore and learn. And then I could come back and get that next vertical job. And that was when they expected me to perform. And there was no time for learning here. It was go get the job done. So always volunteer for the sideways things because you're going to learn a lot from those that will help you kind of be ready when you get those next vertical roles.
CEO Voices examines the communication that enables transformational leadership. June West is Associate Professor of Business Administration and co-founder of the Darden Leadership Communication Council, along with her colleague, Steve Soltis. Soltis is the former head of executive communication at the Coca-Cola Company and lectures at Darden. This podcast is a production of the University of Virginia Darden School of Business.